Hi, Reality Riffing. I sat down with Michael Meade. Well, actually, he stood. I love people who stand for interviews. I'm like really inspired. I really want a standing desk, and Michael Meade really inspired me to get one. But he stood, I sat, and we talked about mythopoetic mysticism and the mythos that really defines our meaning as humans, and he has a fascinating story. Many of you know him through being cohort to Robert Bly and some of the great mythopoetics of our time, and also he edited one of my favorite poetry books, which we talk about. But also, he has a very powerful story of how the myth, the muse, found him in solitary confinement in prison. And he was a conscientious objector. And he is just full of life and wisdom and humor and levity and stories. And I could have talked to him forever, really, but felt very privileged to spend this time with Michael Meade. I hope you enjoy. Hello, Reality Riffing and Immense Grace. I am so honored to be able to have a conversation with the great Michael Meade, founder of Mosaic Multicultural Foundation, and the author of many books. And one of them, Michael, I was just saying to the Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart, that book of poetry, that anthology is something I've literally carried with me for my whole adult life. And just the poetry in there has completely changed my life. So it's a great honor to be here with you.
An honor to be with you as well. Thank you.
And I would love to just hear a little bit about how you found your initiation into kind of myth and how that's moved your life and how it stands now. I just want a check-in.
Well, maybe it all started on my 13th birthday when my aunt didn't ask me what I wanted because I wouldn't have been able to answer that. I was used to not getting what I wanted, so why would I say it? She asked me what I was interested in. I said history. I'm trying to figure out what the hell happened here. And, because my family, the neighborhood, everything's wrecked and people seem to have lost their dreams. And she goes to the store to get a history book. She's a notoriously short woman. They point up to a shelf. They're up there. She reaches up, gets a book. They wrap it. She gives it to me. I tear the cover off, and she goes, "Oh, it's the wrong book." She tries to take it out of my hands. And I'm looking at it, and I'm seeing a horse flying through the air and someone on the horse shooting an arrow that's arcing backwards. And I'm going, "No, I want this book." And she going, "It's the wrong book." And then I pull the rest of the paper off, and it says Mythology by Edith Hamilton. And so it was the wrong book.
Right.
It was a mistaken gift. It was, which is how the genius works, or how the destiny stuff works. And so that night I read almost the entire book and realized I had found my language. I didn't have to grow up. I didn't have to change who I was. I qualified just by being near stories. And so that opened something up. And then, to tell the truth, I had no idea what to do with any of that. And no one encouraged me. When I tried to talk about it, people thought, "What are you talking about?
Right.
Myth doesn't mean anything." And then, 7 years later, so I'm like 20 years old, and long story leads to me being in prison, in a military prison for refusing to go to Vietnam and, die and kill people and all that.
Yeah.
And then it turns out I wasn't a good prisoner. So then they put me in solitary confinement. And in solitary confinement, I was in there for months. And I stopped eating. I could explain that, but I didn't understand why I did that at the time. And so after weeks and weeks of not eating and being by myself in a cell, I realized I was having visitors. There were no visitors. I was by myself. And so there was a point where either I was losing my mind or I was finding my mind.
Yeah.
Because the visitors were characters from myths. And they were there like to support me and even to guide me. And so I realized, why should I fight? I surrendered to the presence of these characters from mythology. And that was when I think I realized, oh, this is my life.
Wow. That's a true initiation. And so has that continued like throughout your life? Do you have visitation in terms of either in dream or in however you describe the creative process? Or, I mean, has that continued?
Good question. Yeah. And I often refer to it now as the muses.
Yeah.
And I keep trying to make deals with them. Sometimes they'll make a deal, often they won't. They like to show up between 4 o'clock in the morning and 4:25. And that's when the delivery occurs, or the download, as people say now. And each night I have to make a choice. Am I waking up a little bit more to take the download? Do I write it down? Or what do I do? I've tried to negotiate, why don't we do 7 o'clock? But anyway.
I've tried that too.
Yeah. So I refer to it as the muses, and because it seems to me that was the source of the stories to begin with. And so, yeah, I'm guided by stories, and I'm guided by things that appear in the middle of the night that feel I'm supposed to bring into daylight.
With you. In the yogic sciences, that time of day is where the veils are thinner, and so many. I mean, Hunter S. Thompson. That was when he, would start writing. Was like around that time. I mean, I think he was up all night doing drugs, but at 4 a.m. he would kind of start doing the creative process. So there is something very, very unique. We call it the Amrit Vela.
All right.
So. It just in the current state of things, what's moving in terms of what you need to do right now? Like, what stories are being asked to be told?
So one of the questions you could say throughout time has been, what myth are we in?
Yeah.
And so that's a hard question to answer, and yet it's easier to answer it now because we're in a sense in the myth of the end, the beginning. We're at the end of an era. The vision or the imagination that people have of the world doesn't work anymore. It's kind of unraveling. It's serious enough that it's affecting the environment and nature. So in mythology, you could imagine that the old word was apocalypsis, which doesn't mean fiery end of the world. It means collapse, renewal.
Yeah.
And it's not collapse and then renewal. The renewal is happening inside the collapse, just the way a forest works, like nature works. And so for me, this is the time of the end of a world, the beginning of a world. Betwixt and between, you can call it the liminal space, is one of the old mythological terms. We're in between. And so that's when messages come through more strongly, because there's less structure in the way. The breaking down of structure allow the muses actually enjoy it more, it seems.
Right.
So there's that. So then that takes me to creation stories. So I wrote a book called Why the World Doesn't End, because in myth the world can't end, because each end is a beginning. And so I've been studying and speaking and writing more about what I call recreation myths, how the world recreates itself, how a person recreates themselves. And so that, to me, there's real essential knowledge there that can be used no matter what stage of life a person is in, and no matter where they're coming from, that we are all being affected by the end of an era, and then we're all being called to help envision and contribute to the remaking of the world. That's my sense.
Yeah. I think, I was thinking about just the myth of this kind of new technological, this fourth industrial revolution, and where myth it starts to take, does it take another shape? I was thinking about this morning, and I've been kind of fixated on this Deus ex machina, just the kind of the human inside the machine and awakening inside the machine and the godhead inside the machine. Anything for you on this?
Well, so what intrigues me is this notion that I've been thinking about since back in solitary confinement. Uh, Humans, in a sense, are all right. On one level, we're frail beings in an enormous universe that's mysterious. On another level, we're each a channel for the divine trying to enter the world. And the divine tries to come through people. And so when we're at the end beginning, the divine is trying to come in more fully. And the trick is, can a person surrender a little bit, the usual self-protection, and step into the vulnerability and the liminality, and find out, how can I be more of a channel for the divine entering into the world, and therefore how can I, in my frail little existence, contribute to the recreation of life on earth. That's how I see it going. And then of course it's difficult to imagine, for a lot of people to imagine, that they could be such a channel. And you had mentioned initiation, and that's the key. If a person hasn't been initiate means to step in, but it also means to reveal. And so one of the meanings is revealing oneself to oneself. And so depending on how we want to go after it in terms of depth psychology, you could call it the deep self. And so when a person realizes that the usual self, the little self, the ego self, is kind of a pretend self, but it is connected to the deep self. And the deep self is the source of imagination. It's a source of love, including love of oneself. And it's the source of the initiatory energy that makes a person able to become a bigger and bigger soul just by surrendering to what's present and being willing to suffer a little bit, something of that kind.
Well, I think that's the piece. I'm very fascinated with Gen Z and a lot of, I'm not quite a millennial, but I missed it by a hair of I was born in 79. But I'm very fascinated to watch kind of what's happening in these younger generations, and this kind of, not there's no space for suffering in a certain way. What are you seeing? In your I don't know, your nieces, your nephews, your generations, the people you teach. How do you think that's showing up? This
Well,
allergy, almost.
I think, well, what's happened is a loss of imagination, really a collapse of imagination. So for most people now, the world is horizontally extended. The World Wide Web, the internet, everything is horizontal. And people are connected, but it's horizontal. So in a way, what's missing is vertical imagination, where it used to be understood that people are standing on the earth and their feet go down into the earth, and yet their imagination goes up into the heavens. And so what I often see and feel is, and with young people, but with older people too, is the loss of this sense of vitality, of vital connection to earth energy and to the movement of the stars. That's who humans are supposed to be. So there's that. And then there's this really, tragic missing ingredient, which is the rite of passage that each young person, traditionally would go through.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that a lot of young people fear that there's nothing inside them. That's what I hear. or Mosaic, we've done a lot of work with young people, especially young
Yeah.
people at risk.
Yeah.
And that's the usual common modern complaint. I don't know who I am. I don't even know if there's anything in there. And so I wrote a book called The Genius Myth, because genius is a Western word, a Latin word that most people know. And it doesn't mean high IQ or big talent. It means the spirit that's already there. And so under duress, I started to talk to young people. Do you know you have a genius? And a genius is also a spirit. It's not human,
Yeah.
it's a spirit. And so once they accept the idea that there's something in me that is not measurable, and that's not even simply human and didn't come from my parents, all of a sudden you can have any kind of conversation about dreams, about spirituality, about love, about anything, because they realize, oh, there's something unique, and it's partially spiritual, and it's partially, inspired, and I have it. And so that's one of the ways that I've tried to fill in that big gap about who we are and why we're here, which I hear from so many young people.
Yeah. Well, we're focused this weekend, particularly in our scene where we're talking a lot about relationships, and it's been a kind of lifelong adult lifelong study. Well, actually, it started quite young for me, just looking at kind of the way that the relational kind of myth is moving through our consciousness, and I'm curious. It just in these initiation, obviously, I came upon Iron John, and the was around a lot of mythopoetic men's work, and my mom was a feminist, and all this kind of the call and response that was happening. And I'm curious what your living a long life of relationships and love and loss, and where that stands for you in terms of the mythos and love and relationship.
Great question. So in mythology, love, the god of love in the Western world is Eros, and in the Eastern world, it's Kama. And so the god of love is the firstborn god, because without love, there is no world, which makes the god of love the youngest god. But since it came at the beginning, it's also the oldest god. So the deities of love are there for the young and the old, and are there to make the young, greater and wiser, and there to make the olders younger.
Yeah.
So Eros is so, and then there's this weird thing going on. This world we live in. There's a new book out, but there's been several recent books out about the loss of Eros. And you would think, in terms of quarantine, people would have been getting more into it, but apparently not. There's actually Eros is diminishing in the world, which includes a diminishing of fertility, a loss of a decrease of sperm cells. This is all being studied. They study
Yeah.
everything now
Yeah.
except imagination. But so 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 even on the level of love, there's a collapse going on. And so anyway, to me, and tomorrow's the beginning of spring, and spring would be the return of Eros, the return of Kama. And so we're in that moment right now in terms of the calendar, but we're in a moment of collapse when it comes to Eros. And so, on the other hand, it's time to rediscover Eros. And so when you see what's going on in terms of non-binary gender identities and that kind of thing, and the increase in the number of trans children, it's as if Eros is saying, do not lock this stuff into binary ideas. Do not make it, do not calculate it. Do not make it subject to logic. Let it be the wild thing that it is, the thing that causes the flowers to erupt from the earth, the thing that stands the trees up, the thing that allows us to bring the stars down. I think we're being invited to reimagine, re-experience Eros, and by doing that, help Eros come back into the world. My sense of it.
Beautiful. That really resonates with me. I feel like there is there are these kind of laws of love and laws of life that in some way I have been, with the lack of initiation, these are not installed in our kind of consciousness as we grow. And I think that's also part of this kind of awakening of love in all of its different kind of forms, is that there's some sort of multiplicity and opening that has to happen. And I love the way you describe it, and that we are an equinox eve. So it's a special day for us as yogis, but also just in the mythos. Um, when you're kind of working with men and young men, and I know obviously you did so much work in the mythopoetic men's movement and just all of that. Just curious, where, what in the evolution of your experience of being a man and working with men, what you found in this kind of new time, and what's happening, and what are there new challenges, or is it always this kind of initiation challenge? What's happening in the world of men?
I mean, I don't really know that much. I've worked with men, I've worked with, male youth, but I've
Yeah,
worked with a lot of women. I've
yeah,
worked with,
yeah,
when we did our youth work, it was girls and boys.
yeah,
So I will say a couple of things. I think it does come back to initiatory stuff.
yeah.
So um, everyone has a genius and everyone has the call of their genius. But eros, love, is another genius. And so everybody has their eros calling. It's part of the previously necessary initiation of life, is to recognize how I'm being called to be in the garden of love, to be in the realm of love.
Mm,
And so in a way, it's all been forgotten, but now it's all trying to be remembered. And so in that sense, it's a good time to be alive. But I like to think of it as, how am I called into the garden of love, for instance? And so then an idea connected, so this goes back to creation. Um, First of all, creation is not something that happened and now we're in the aftermath of it. Creation is ongoing all the time. And every act of love is an act of creation. Sometimes it creates a child. Other times it puts more love in the world. And so I think we're being invited into a reimagination of being initiated to the love making that makes the world possible. And then just on this, so then if you connect the energy of creation with what's going on inside a person, I've always been fascinated by the moment of lovemaking. I mean, when the love is being made. So in terms of myth, that means we're putting love in the world.
yeah.
But also the only way to be in that moment is to be oneself. No self-help book or practice that I've ever found can get you to that moment unless we surrender and show up as ourselves. And so I don't even know what to make of that, except it's one of the most beautiful things. And each time people show up as themselves, we have rejoined creation. And we are actually channels for the creative energy that could put Eros back into the world. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what winds up happening when you think about Eros from a mythological point of view.
Yeah.
And so in working with men or working with women, because I've done work with women who have been sexually abused, and also with women who have had miscarriages or abortions, because there's a whole interruption of Eros that happens there. And then what do we do about that? And then often with men, it's different, because what's happened is the love energy has been turned or has become more based in lust and more based in dominance. And so I've worked on both sides of that road. And it still seems to me that it turns out that a person has to find a revelation of the self in order to be present enough to realize both, how do I say that I am loved, right? So part of the love story is how the deep self loves the person who's the vehicle for the deep self. And then it's from there that we're able to give love. And so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I always enjoy stumbling in the garden of
Yes,
love.
yes. It's a good stumble. It's the best. It's the best. Um, so when I'm very fascinated with how kind of the idea or the mental interplay of what you could call depth psychology or the myth brought to life, how that then animates in our actual lived experience. And I'm curious what you have, what's both current for you, but also maybe not quite advice, but inspiration for those who are noticing that there's something animating their lives that maybe is more than just their kind of smaller idea of what that might be.
Well, so being older now, one thing I've thankfully, gratefully learned is that Eros takes many more forms in getting older. And it actually can be richer in so many ways. It's hard to explain that, but in a sense, early on, there's maybe a rush that's not totally necessary. And maybe there's a tendency to follow other people's ideas, which may not be that necessary. And then eventually it's really not that Eros goes away. I was surprised to find out that is not the case,
Yeah.
that it actually broadens and deepens if we allow it. So that's a way of encouraging older people to realize getting older doesn't mean a loss of Eros.
Yeah.
I haven't found that to be true.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, it can go the other way around. It
Yeah.
can be the opposite.
Yeah.
And in terms of younger people, um, this essential idea, we love best, most accurately and most generously as ourselves. That somehow the becoming of oneself is also the opening of the uh, erotic channels and the capacity to even imagine the beloved and so on. So that's those two things. And then one other thing, because you were talking about relationship, and to me, relationship is a profound mystery that, like all mysteries, is trying to be solved. Uh, and
Unsolved mysteries.
so so what psychology offers this great idea, in a sense that everything that we want, that we love, that we want to learn about, we project onto someone or something else. And so everyone's being called by the beloved. And I think being specifically called, the beloved is unique to each person because the beloved is the essence of all of life and all of love. So it can only manifest the way a person can see it and feel it. And then a relationship is partly how I project my imagination, my soulful sense of the beloved onto someone, which is both fantastic and not to be missed and should be fully indulged in, and also is inaccurate.
Right.
Because that person cannot be the beloved because the beloved is my own unique take on the divine. So that leaves me to places of forgiveness and forgiving each other for, first of all, gratitude for each partner being willing to receive the projection of the beloved,
Yeah.
and then apologies and forgiveness for the fact that we mishandled each other in trying to keep finding more of the beloved together, something like that.
Well, I've always been tickled. I remember reading something Robert Bly wrote about basically on the wedding day. It's a very kind of dark day because the groom and the bride or whoever is the people who are being married, they exchange what he calls like the long bag that you drag behind you.
Yeah.
I just remember being, but this is true. I mean, this is, I had that experience of being at a wedding day or some sort of betrothing kind of ceremony and it being very heavy because you're getting in the ring with someone.
Well, it's to me, it's kind of beautiful in a way. I didn't understand it, when I was younger. So the symbols around marriage, let's say. So you have the wedding cake, and then the two grooms, two brides, bridegroom, whatever we're working on.
Yeah.
They're standing on top. Well, the layers of the cake, that's the cosmos. And the two people getting betrothed or married, whatever we're going to call it, are actually each representing the opposite, no matter what the gender stuff is about. They're each representing a distinct aspect of the cosmos, and they're willing to join together. And so they're standing at the center of the cosmos in this willingness to kind of surrender to love, beauty, and the reckless engagement of lives. And so the tradition was that everyone at a wedding can renew the vows that they have because those two have opened the gates of love and everyone can. So that was part of the beauty of weddings. And so, and instead, what's happened is so amazing to consider the ancient ideas and the modern practice because the modern practice becomes, can you make the perfect wedding? And all the things have to be in their place and everybody has to work and it takes months to get it together. And what happened to the love? What happened to the beauty? In Africa, for instance, they say if you have a ceremony like that and nothing gets broken, then the brokenness will occur in the relationship.
Yeah.
So that's why in Judaism they break the glass
Right.
in the middle. So we're on the verge, if we're willing, to be part of the rediscovery of all the aspects of ritual and myth and the mysteries of love and imagination. But I sympathize for the two people in a sense who are standing on the top of the cake when no one knows that it's the cosmic moment, that no one knows that they're representing, the kind of union that everybody wants to have. So I used to get invited a lot. People would say, "Would you marry us?" And I'd say, "You realize what you're asking? I've been divorced twice." I said, "I really can't do that. I mean, all honesty, I don't want to do harm,
Yeah.
but I will tell poems on the occasion."
Hmm.
And so then I bring Rumi and Hafez, and then I tell poems and give people some hints about what the marriage is about and how that ceremony could be turned into a healing for everybody involved. Um, and I also understand what you're saying. There's another old idea that says the bride and the groom, or the groom and the groom, the bride, whoever it is, they get into bed at the night of the wedding, and that's all a beautiful thing, and in whatever way they want to make it beautiful.
Right.
And while they're sleeping, all of the ancestors on either family side begin to gather underneath the bed.
Hmm.
And eventually that stuff gathering underneath is going to come up. And
Hmm.
so,
Hmm.
and that's when the trouble comes.
Yep. Yep.
But it's considered good trouble because there's an old saying, alchemical saying, without relationships, we cannot grow psychologically.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
so heaven and hell.
Heaven and hell.
It's the garden of love, and then suddenly it turns into the nightmare. And the lovers have to say, okay, all right, I came for this.
Yeah.
I came for this
Yeah.
because love will shred the fixed attitudes in order to get to the core essence.
And when we're talking about vows, I'm just curious, in the we're so kind of divorced from these rituals and these vows and these initiations, and I think sometimes we're under the spell of vows that we don't even know that we've taken, and all this. Where does, I mean, I know this comes up a lot in Mythos of being, kind of sleeping awake and the all those types of things. But I feel that's part of what's going on the planet right now, is that there's a lot of sleeping awake people, or awake sleeping people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the major themes in popular culture is The Walking Dead.
Yeah,
I always interpret the popular themes as collective psychology.
yeah,
And so, people talk about the zombie apocalypse. They're talking about people being asleep when the world is asking us to wake up.
yeah,
So, yeah. And there's a lot of pressure on everybody. So going to sleep makes some kind of sense because, and going back to young people cannot, they cannot help but inhale the world they're growing up in. And everyone's growing up now in a world where most people think the world might not survive.
yeah,
And so young people are inhaling the end. They're inhaling Thanatos. So in Greek mythology, Eros, the god of love, was opposite Thanatos, the god of death. And so anybody right now, unfortunately, in a way, growing up is growing into the struggle between love and death. And it's a really heavy thing, especially if no one knows stories and if no one understands myth and imagination, then you're facing it as a frail, vulnerable person.
yeah.
And so people used to wrap themselves in stories and find themselves in stories as a way of both protection and guidance. And then, so the good news, I would say, is there's an endless number of stories about creation, about love, about beauty, about meaning.
I think, you brought up death, and part of what I've been seeing and, working with, and we all have been, is the hysteria and the fear and the suppressed kind of lack of story or myth or understanding or initiation into death and death rites, and what death is and how it operates, is, I think, fueling so much of the fear and hysteria on the planet. Anything that you've kind of discovered or seen, or anything you can share with us around that?
I think we're in a collective rite of passage.
Yeah.
And rites of passage always have death in the middle. There's an old saying, a culture that begins by denying death will end up denying life. And we've been in denial of life, of the multiplicity of life, of the diversity of life, of the insistence of eros, of the pulse of imagination for so long that it's as if now a lot of death has to happen to wake people back up to life. Um, all young people used to be oriented to the presence of death during their first initiation.
Right.
The old Irish statement is death is the middle of a long life. The core mystery is birth, death, rebirth, life, death, renewal. And we're all in it, and we're all in it all the time, but everybody's been pretending we're not.
Yeah.
And so now death is being put right in front of everyone with the pandemic, with the death of species in nature. And so on one hand, it can seem overwhelming and oppressive, but knowledge of death does not diminish life. It increases the understanding of the beauty of life. And so I think it's a collective initiation trying to awaken people to a greater sense of life by a brush with death.
Yeah.
And so the mystery, again, the core mystery, no matter what mythology or culture I've been able to study, is always life, death, renewal. And we're in the death on the way to renewal phase. And having that philosophical idea, having practices from the ancient cultures, they all have death in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
as they used to say, death is the first teacher.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it teaches about life. And as the Africans say, when death finds you, let it find you alive. That's what Eros is saying. You know, when death finds us, let it find us alive. And alive means allowing all of the inner energies to be present, because everybody has repressed, rejected energies that are essentially important to life eventually. And Eros is the place, the garden is where all those energies are invited. So we're not going to change the loss of Eros in the world, the diminishing of fertility and the loss of sperm and all the stuff that's going on. We're not going to fix that scientifically. We're going to
Right.
fix it by bringing more Eros into the world. And the only thing we have to work with is our own life. And if we can bring more Eros to our lives, it begins to affect other people's lives in meaningful ways. And the garden gets bigger and the ecstatic becomes more possible.
I mean, in a time, we're in the wellness industry, which has become this kind of microscopic, hysterical self care and self help, and basically with the tenet that something is absolutely wrong with us, and we better get some chaga or some cream or some whatever the thing is. And I think that we're kind of what we don't understand is even the biome itself. It changes without a probiotic or prebiotic or fermented food or an organic. It changes just in the essence of ecstasy or in the essence of some sort of revelation or imagination or inspiration. The biome changes. Our digest, and so I think that these are the parts where that kind of microscopic dissection of health and all this kind of stuff has become, another neurosis, another version of our neurosis.
If it's trying to say, I can avoid, I can be perfect, or I can be pure, or I can be so natural I can't get a disease,
Right.
then it's gone the wrong way. It's gone against nature.
Yeah.
Nature is full of bugs and germs and all kinds of things. That is part of nature, is part of our gut. When you were talking about that, I was thinking about, body wisdom versus mental intelligence. And so another thing waiting to be relearned is the wisdom of the body,
Yeah.
which some cultures called lunar knowledge. In other words, the body, of course, women's bodies specifically, but everybody's bodies, because the feminine is in men too. Culture doesn't know that, but it has to all be inside everybody.
Yeah.
And so the bodies are tied to the moon as opposed to the sun. And so it's lunar knowledge, it used to be. And what's lunar knowledge? Lunar, the moon is going through phases all the time. Every time you look up, the moon has changed. It disappears sometimes too. The sun is a little bit more predictable, a little bit less exciting, really, because it just shows up the same way all the time. The moon is changed. So people used to imagine the moon was more powerful than the sun because change is the essence of life. And then the moon was always connected to the body. And so one of the things I think waiting to be learned better is lunar knowledge, the wisdom of the body, which is not the same as trying to eat perfectly. It's more like being more natural in terms of the flow of one's own nature.
Yeah.
So all the stuff's waiting, and it is in the process of being rediscovered. That's the renewal side. Just as everything is collapsing, seemingly, all these other things are trying to come back in. And I think the interest in, certain kinds of food and certain kinds of living, when it's not about perfection, is actually trying to get to what the body knows, what the plants know,
Yeah. Yeah.
what the animal passing by is actually offering in terms of intelligence.
And so I'm always curious. I ask everyone, besides your 4 a.m., appointment with your muses, with the sirens, as it were, how does your creative process go? Like how does it, and has it changed kind of being in the experience of the lockdowns and stuff, or what does it, I'm always very curious about this.
Yeah, well, it's dramatically changed.
Yeah.
Because of COVID and the pandemic. I mean, I'm used to being in front of audiences like
Yeah.
almost all the time,
Yeah.
and so that was a real shock. And so and people say, oh, you just like to be on stage. It's not that. Being on stage is a ritual.
Yeah.
Theater is one of the oldest rituals in the world.
Yes.
And what
Yes.
happens is the even the casual understanding of the theater, if you think of well, theaters used to have the cosmos painted above the stage. So being on stage is being center stage in the cosmos. And the idea that I stumbled into was you stand there and allow it to come in, whatever's coming in.
Right.
So I'd be on my way to the stage and I'd have a story in mind. I really want to tell this story and I've got a really smart interpretation of it and this is going to be great for me. And I'm on the way to the stage and another story comes in. And I learned the painful, hard way. I have to accept that story.
Yeah.
And then I have to stand in that story. And so for me, it's always been about being in the spontaneous moment. It's true at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then it's true on stage. And I've had to work to refine it again, kind of on Zoom.
Right.
or,
Right.
and also, and so, which strangely can work.
It can. It can.
Because that energy is so determined to be alive, it'll work through Zoom or whatever people are going to come up with. But it's actually turned out to be a really creative time.
Yeah.
Because there is more time.
Yeah.
And I've mostly stayed home.
Yeah.
And so I'm writing more. I'm finding more ways to express things. And so it's been really creative. And it is like an initiation in the sense that one of the first thing in initiation is the first step is separation. Well, we all just got separated for almost a year, separated from each other, separated from jobs, separated from community.
Yeah.
And then the next step is a descent into loss, into darkness, into death. That's the second step.
Yeah.
And then the third step is the renewal and the remaking of community. And so we've all been in a creative descent when we can find the intelligence of that. And so it's been compelling. Naturally, I miss being with people. I miss being in the intimacy of community, and that kind of thing. But I've also allowed the descent to happen, and I've found new practices and new areas of imagination.
Something I talk about, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. I talk about kind of if you awake in a myth that you are telling yourself or that is being lived through you, and it's not, you feel like this is not my beautiful house, this is not my beautiful life. You're having a David Byrne moment. I always tell people, and I believe this, that you have to start to tell another story. You have to self conceive of a new myth, and that's actually, in my opinion, the foundation of all spiritual practice in some way. What do you think about that?
So I struggle with new myths because myths, to me, myths are ancient and immediate at the same time.
Yeah.
So remember the past 20 years. People have been talking about the new paradigm. The word paradigm, the meaning of the word paradigm is really similar to the meaning of the word archetype. Archetype means the original shape, the original model, the ancient model. Paradigm is, actually means next to it. So it means like being next to a model. So the new paradigm is the old archetype come back with a new outfit on. Mm-hmm. That's what I think's going on. Mm-hmm. And so I agree with you. A person has to find the next element of the story. But I've had this strange experience that I mentioned being in solitary confinement. The story that is our story, which I'm lately calling it the personal myth, isn't a completely different story and we become a different person. It's the deeper revelation of the story that we've been struggling with all along. Mm. So that, so that's why I mentioned being in solitary. There's nothing in there but my 20-year-old fearful, agonized self. And then there is something else in there. And it's this whole other realm that was intended to be found. And in my case, I probably needed to be locked down in order to find it. I would have been running away from it so fast. And so I like to find those things in a person's story that are indelible, that if you took that away, they'd be gone too. And the indelible story usually has the wounds and the gifts both.
Yeah.
So that's another old idea, that our deepest wounds are right next to our deepest gifts. And so we have to accept both. And yeah, once you're there, then you are the ground from which stories will keep coming. And the deep self in psychology has no limit. And so, so I don't know if I'm being clear, but part of the initiation is finding the revelation in the story that I thought was killing me. But underneath that wound, there was this gift of another self arising, or another version of myself. And so it's close like that. Close like that.
It's very, very intimate. You could say it's the same coordinate, in fact.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Turned into darkness, turned into light. The one coming from the other, both coming from that person.
So in one way, this is like an inside out version of what I just said. Which I like very much, just for my titillation, is that when you awaken the myth and maybe you don't like it, or you have resistance to it, or it's living you in ways that it feels like foreign to you, or whatever the thing is, that if you kind of open to the energy animating you, or the story that's being told through you, then that is actually the transformation.
Yes. Most people, it seems to me, are living someone else's story.
Yeah.
Right? Because the child comes into the world, and nowadays people think the child belongs to the family. Like in ancient Ireland, they said only 1/3 of the child belongs to the family. The child is born 1/3 from the parents. They're the combination of them, on the wedding cake, their DNA, whatever you want to call it. Then there's a third that is pure spirit, sent to the world to help solve the mystery, or live the mystery, or whatever. And then the other third might be like an ancestor coming back to try it again. Like that's the Buddhist angle of the Irish. So a person is those three things. So the family doesn't know who their child is. And they're supposed to love that child and protect it and nourish it with everything that they can bring to bear, but not imagine that it's their child. That's because the child is its own initiatory self. And so, because everybody forgets that, then each child gets packed with all the stuff the parents are trying to unload, or trying to project, or hoping the child will bring. And that's the story we're trying to shed. And then inside that, which is agonizing until it's recognized and ecstatic when it's found, is the story really trying to live through that child.
Yeah.
And so most of life is shedding the things that were obscuring the story that was trying to come out. And so I guess that's what I mean.
Yeah.
And so, that shedding has to happen. And it's actually, it's initiatory when the shedding is happening. But so there's another old rule, I can't prove it, but it's charming, that by 20 years of age, everyone has had an experience of the deep self.
Yeah.
It's usually been covered over with other people's ideas and expectations, or one's own fears. So it's there. So that's another idea that I found in mythology that I just, love. Each soul born is unique. The way Emerson said it was, nature only makes originals.
Right.
The whole forest of cedar trees, each tree is different. No two ravens are the same, and no two souls are the same. So each person is a unique project of imagination, love, and recklessness, trying to be lived out into the world. And we're trying to get to that story. and all the packed on stuff needs to be shed in order for that story to be revealed, and that's a lifetime
That's a
usually.
lifetime. Yeah. Or lifetimes, as it were. Michael, would you end with a story or a myth or a poem or something? Like, would you mind giving us something like
I've got a
this?
little story. I've
Okay.
got a little story, and
Okay.
then maybe a poem.
Okay.
So um, so it turns out there was this man in a small village who several times a day would pray, and he would pray in the courtyard next to the temple that was in the village. And it happened one day when he was in the courtyard and had just begun his prayers that a young woman kind of passed through the courtyard and didn't even notice him, but he noticed her. And so, in a way, well, he thought she interrupted his prayer, and that upset him, and it confounded him, and it really bothered him. Turns out she was on the way to meet her lover. After a while, they finished whatever they were doing, and she was on her way back through the same courtyard. And at that point, the man of prayers was still there, and he was still upset. And so he said something like, "Young woman, do you know how insolent you are? Do you understand how you are breaking rules? No one's supposed to pass through the courtyard or pass through when people are praying. Do you understand the damage that you have done?" And she says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to dishonor anybody or do any damage. But I have a question. What do you mean by prayer?" And so the man of prayer says, "Well, a prayer is the attempt to have a conversation with God. A prayer is like talking directly to God." And so the young woman said, "Oh, I get it." She said, "I have another question though. If you were talking to God and my passage through there distracted and interrupted your conversation with God, how could it be that I was on my way to see the beloved and I never even noticed you?" So the point is that each person's conversation with God is their own pathway, and that there are many pathways to get to the divine, and eros and love is one of them, and it is in no way inferior to what might happen in the temple. So that's my springtime equinox eros little story.
I love it.
And and so a prayer, a song, a poem,
Yeah.
and
Any.
they're all the same thing.
Yeah.
There's an old saying, a prayer is a song is a poem. This is Hafez. You have already been invited to meet the beloved, and no one can resist such a divine invitation. In the end, all choices narrow down to just two. We can come to God dressed for dancing, or we can be carried on a stretcher to God's emergency ward. So in other words, we're either going to take on the role of being a lover of life, of being in the Garden of Eros, of being willing to live our story into the world for the sake of inner expression and also for the sake of outer healing and greater manifestation of life, or we'll be dragged there anyway, only to the emergency ward. Little tag on from Rumi.
Okay.
Rumi says, the center leads to love. Soul opens to creation's core. Hold on to your particular pain, for that too can take you to God. So those are just little poetic statements from the ecstatic poets.
Thank you so much. I really love talking to you and feel so blessed, and I cherish you and I cherish your work and your legacy and everything that you're doing and becoming. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Good to be in a big conversation that includes so many things, including love and pain.
No conversation is complete for me without some love and pain.
Agreed.
Well, happy equinox, and
Okay.
bless you, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Same to you.
Thank
Be
you,
well.
Michael. Be well.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of Reality Riffing. These are conversations that I think are important with people who are doing great things in the world about subject matters that need to be discussed. If you enjoyed the content, the conversation, please feel free to share with your people, share with your friends and family, rate the podcast below, and also subscribe. So in the upcoming parapsychology of the moving thought forms training, you need to teach the face reading, and everyone wants to know, what's face reading?
The face is the entryway into the energetic portal of that individual. And everybody's an individual, and everyone has their own kind of unique history. And how they've arranged that history is all kind of billboarded on the face, and how they've magnetically experienced it, and they're broadcasting it, reliving it, buried it, or fighting with it. It's all very evident as soon as you kind of look at their face and know how to decode the tremendous amounts of information that they're broadcasting from the face. So we need to know how to do that in order to be able to conscious of our own direction and helping others in their direction.
And so you're going to teach this during?
Yeah, we have to, as part of the parapsychology of moving thought forms, because we have to identify how that individual has stored and filed the thought forms that are dominating their incarnation. And their thought stream is created by the thought forms that are broadcasting. So in order to move those thought forms, we have to identify where the person is and then know how to move them out of that position to a better position.
And so would this relate to when you're doing a meditation, sometimes you feel your face move, like something,
yes.
Face moving?
A lot of times you'll feel some kind of energetic shift somewhere in the body, the system, and you're not sure what exactly is occurring. And if you know how to read the language a little bit, then you go, oh, that is a particular block that I am now breaking through, I'm releasing, and that'll become less of an obstacle. Or that particular energetic configuration is something that I've entangled with another or an environment with, and that's creating obstacles and difficulties in my life. So I can now unravel that because I put more energy into it and had the conscious awareness and intelligent kind of skill to disassemble it and reassemble it in a better form.
Would you say this is also why when you look at yourself after you do a deep meditation, you look different?
And sometimes you don't recognize who's looking back at you. If you don't recognize who's looking back at you, then you've really now gone to a place where you're deeper, much more deeper in your soul, and you're out of your kind of personality realm, and you're imprinted, kind of conditioned realm into your pure infinite realm. And that's the quest.